Fiona, morning everyone. Quite a big group here, so a very exciting agenda. So really delighted to be hosting today. This initiative from Times Higher has come as perhaps a surprise to some of us, maybe as a source of great excitement and joy to many of us, and a sight of or a sort of concern to others. Do the SDGs lend themselves to a ranking? Could we actually hit the SDG targets yet miss the point? So very interesting session today. Really delighted to welcome Duncan Ross. Duncan's the Chief Data Officer of Times Higher Education, and Laura Tucker. She's the MD of Vertigo Ventures, a partner for the Times Higher in the development of this. So the SDGs, as many of us in the EAUC know, many of us have signed the SDG Accord, is the world's new to-do list. So they put universities and colleges and students and research and learning right at the heart of driving, experimenting, researching and practicing the SDGs, which what I always summarize as reducing hunger and poverty, reducing extreme inequality, and challenging and addressing and changing climate change. So without any further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Duncan and Laura. The plan for today is that they've got quite a lot to get through today in slides. Then Fiona will pick up and start to make some linkages with the EAUC's programs, the Accord and the scorecard particularly, and then lots of time for you, lots of time for questions. So please welcome Duncan and Laura.
So thank you, Ian and Fiona, for inviting us to participate in this. So as Ian said, my name's Duncan Ross. I'm Chief Data Officer for Times Higher Education. We have been a part of the HE sector for the last 50 years. And in 2004, we started generating world university rankings. I'm probably better known than Laura, so I will invite Laura to say a little bit about Vertigo Ventures.
Great, thank you. So I'm Laura from Vertigo Ventures. It's wonderful to be here. So we've been working for the last 8 years or 9 years now with universities, and we started off working with social enterprises and not-for-profits to help them report on the impact. So really what difference they were making, not only in terms of financial, in terms of profit and loss accounts, but also in terms of societal and environmental impact. So we started off working with different organizations back 9 years ago, and we now work with about 30 universities, or 32 universities now in the UK, Australia, Hong Kong, and the Netherlands, predominantly through providing training capacity with the research officers and through how to capture and identify, capture and report impact information. But I think there is very much this sort of cultural shift and journey that the universities are on, that we've been seeing anyway, to actually help report their impact information.
So a little bit about where we're coming from in terms of building out a ranking. As I said before, we launched our first World University Ranking in 2004. And this is very much still the main ranking we produce alongside our editorial and other services. But it's very much focused on research-intensive universities and the research mission. 3 years ago, as we started developing the rankings out, we noticed that there was, firstly, there was a big gap there in terms of understanding the teaching mission. But increasingly, as time has gone past, we have also understood that there is definitely a very big gap in terms of looking at what we initially thought of as impact and innovation. And this project actually started out with a focus very much on innovation. We did some data gathering last year, but as we explored that, we came to the conclusion that focusing purely on innovation would be to miss a major opportunity. Increasingly, as we discussed this with universities, their own focus wasn't on the narrow area of innovation, it was much more on broad societal impact. And as we looked into that, it became clear to us that the best way of moving that forward was to look at pinning this on the SDG framework. That this effectively gave us an established framework which we could start to gather data around, very much with the hope that we can surface good practice across the globe. And I think that's an important thing to remember here. We're not just focusing on developed nations or the global north. We need to have something that will genuinely give global south institutions an opportunity to showcase the work that they are doing in this area. So just to reinforce this, we really want to be able to show how the higher education sector is working towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we believe this will be the first time that there is a global ranking that will be doing this. We acknowledge in doing this that we are coming with our own cultural biases. So particularly in the first iteration, there will be things that we put into the ranking that we may not wish to continue when we start seeing the data that comes back, and particularly where that data comes from. We've tried where possible to acknowledge and to remove our own biases, but we know that some of those will have crept through. It is important to say that what we don't want to do is build out a ranking that simply rewards wealthy universities for having the infrastructure that enables them to respond to lots of questions. If we're doing that, then that would be, I think, betraying really the goal of what we're about here. I genuinely want to give institutions across the world the opportunity to be visible and to shine. So, Laura, do you want to talk a little bit about the goals themselves?
I think, from my understanding, that hopefully everyone is very familiar and comfortable with the SDG goals in what they're about. But I guess what is useful to share, and I think the main point that, just to follow from what Duncan was sharing, is that this version is a step in this direction. I think it's been highlighted so much in the last week in particular about the need to start, the need to be continuing and accelerating really the progress in this area. And I think that hopefully this is something that where the ranking can help lend itself to the movement and to actually embed impact reporting in that, demonstrating what difference the universities and the global HE sector are making towards the SDGs as this framework, because we've seen it in pockets where Western universities are having an impact through the national assessments in some way. We're seeing it through things like the SDG Accord reporting coming in. And so this is a really fantastic opportunity to grow this work.
Yes, we have been talking to universities about social impact and sustainable impact for several years now, but in a fairly informal way. We did take this to much more formally to our Young University Summit in Florida this spring, and we asked the universities, and there were over 60 universities present, where they thought their universities were focusing on, which SDGs they thought their university was focusing on, and for your interest, here we have the answers. No surprise, most universities had a focus on quality education. You'd be amazed if that wasn't the case. But it was quite interesting to see some of the other areas of focus. So industry, innovation, infrastructure, decent work and economic growth, both scored very strongly. Perhaps interestingly, zero hunger, clean water and sanitation were slightly lower down. And we did have universities from across the world there. We had a significant proportion from Southeast Asia. We had universities from Africa. The University of Ghana was there. And so we did get some genuinely interesting insights out of that. And that did help us shape the approach we've taken in this first iteration. So our theory of change around this is in three broad areas. When we look at how we think universities can demonstrate the way that they are working towards the SDGs, we will be looking at elements around research, because clearly creating knowledge, as I've said here, is a key factor about how universities will be impacting the world. There is an element of stewardship. So is the university being responsible and positive about the way it manages its own resources? And then finally, there's an area of outreach, which in some ways is the hardest to measure in a consistent fashion. To what extent are universities generally reaching out and trying to take their full part in civic society? Now, for the first year, we haven't been able to build out metrics for all of the SDGs. We have focused on 11 of the 17. We do hope in future iterations that we will be able to extend to the additional 6 SDGs. And we will base this partly on our experience in the first iteration. So it's very important to say that wherever we get to in this first ranking, we expect some fairly significant changes as we move into second and subsequent iterations. We want to allow universities to submit data for as many of these 11 as they wish. If you submit to fewer than 4 SDGs, then we will be able to evaluate your performance in that single SDGs. But if you supply data for 4 or more, and the 4 should include number 17, partnership in the goals, then we will also include you in the overall ranking. So as I said, we're going to invite universities to submit data. The submissions process will open in late October or early November, and there will be a full document which will provide guidance about how we expect universities to measure the metrics. Our experience of doing this in the past is that we encourage universities to think carefully about what a particular metric might mean in their context. If we provide too much guidance, what we find is we're prescribing the data that people will supply rather than allowing them to match that to their own circumstances. A university in East Africa, for example, will have very different understandings of certain terms and data than a university in North America. Where we have questions, we tend to build those into an iterative, frequently asked question document. So for each SDG, we'll collect some data from universities. We will also collect data from Elsevier, our bibliometric supplier. And we hope to be able to produce an overall ranking, but also explore individual SDGs. And the first iteration results will be shared at a summit we'll be doing at KAIST in Korea in early April 2019. So how can universities participate? Firstly, if you do want to participate, please ensure that you have logon details. For most of you who are from UK universities, your institutions will have logon details already set up, but these will usually be owned by the institutional research department. So if you have any questions about that, please do email us on this dedicated email address. The main rules for participation, we have some rules, but they are very limited. We're looking for universities that teach undergraduates and that have a local accreditation. Having said that, we are open to data from universities outside that group or research institutions. We just can't guarantee to include you in the rankings in the first instance. The time period for the data we're looking at is for the year that most closely matches January to December 2017. And again, in the methodology, there's a description about how best to assess which academic year fits in that criteria. Important to say that although we are asking for data, we may not include data that we gather in the final ranking. This could be due to overall data quality. It could also be due to variation issues. So if we have data where everyone answers yes, for example, it's interesting, but probably not very good as a way of differentiation. We do explicitly want to reward visibility, and this is where initiatives like the SDG Accord come in. We want to encourage visibility for 2 reasons. Firstly, it supports external verification. So if you say that you are encouraging women to apply to your university and you publish the ways that you intend to do that publicly, then the public have the ability to question you on that and query whether or not you're living up to that. So that's a really important sort of self-verification aspect. But we also think, as Fiona mentioned, that actually encouraging institutions to publish what they are doing will, in its own right, support universities in moving towards, working towards the SDGs. Because if you're publishing the data, then you can be held accountable to it, and that in turn encourages you to do better in that. We do want evidence to be submitted, ideally by URL where it is publicly available, but we will have a mechanism for submitting documents as well. So moving on to what we'll be measuring, and apologies that this is slightly a gallop through some very detailed areas, but we do want to give lots of time for questions. The slides will be made available later on as well. As I've said, we'll be collecting data around 11 of the 17 SDGs, but you don't have to supply data for all of them. If you think that actually there are 5 that your university are working particularly strongly on, by all means, just supply data for those 5. I have a beautiful build here, but I will ruin it by just rushing through it. So the idea here is to give you a way that, an insight into the way that our metrics link in with the SDGs. As you're all familiar, there are 17 SDGs, there are currently 169 indicators associated with that, and 223 unique targets. From those 17 SDGs, we've identified the 11 that we're working with in the first year. From those, we've built out 47 metrics, and those metrics don't necessarily directly relate to the indicators. As you're familiar, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, the SDGs themselves are built not specifically for universities. So in many cases, the indicators themselves don't have a direct relationship to the work that universities may be doing, even though we think that the work that universities are doing can have a huge beneficial impact on those indicators. So from the 47 metrics we then have 111 things we are measuring, and we have, where possible, we've drawn an indirect link between those 111 measurements and the 223 discrete targets. Sometimes those measurements are more directly related, sometimes those relationships are slightly less direct, but we've tried to draw those links where possible, and those are in the notes. So we have just over 10 minutes, and we have 11 SDGs to go for. What we're going to do is we're going to try and focus on the broad areas. In a few cases, we'll look in slightly more detail to illustrate types of data we're after. So the first of the SDGs we're looking at, number 3, good health and well-being. And there are 3 broad areas we'll be looking at here. I've identified these using lowercase Roman numerals to try and avoid confusion between these metrics and the SDG indicators and targets. So the 3 areas we're looking at for good health and well-being, the first one is research data, and that will be coming from our partners Elsevier. The second element is looking at the number of graduates who are graduating in health-related professions. That doesn't mean that they are necessarily qualified to practice yet, but it's looking at that funnel of provision of support into the health professions. And then the third element is looking at what we call a pick list. So this is quite different for us. Traditionally, when we've been measuring things, we looked at continuous indicators. So the proportion of graduates in health professions, for example, is a continuous variable. But with the pick list, we're actually looking for evidence of things like policies and activities. For the first of the SDGs, we'll look in a little more detail here. So for the research metric, because we're working with Elsevier, we have quite a lot of flexibility in terms of how we'll measure this. The nice thing about health in terms of the SDG and research is that they are very precise about the areas that they're looking at. And so we are able to look into the Scopus data set and pull out very explicitly papers that are around, for example, these areas. But we're not limited to citations, which is the conventional way we've measured this, and we'll be exploring with Elsevier where we can find more appropriate measures. A good example around health might be looking at downloads of documents rather than necessarily citations, because downloads may give us a stronger indication of where these papers are being used in the field rather than where they're being used to drive further academic research. But that's something we'll be exploring in detail with Elsevier over the coming months. In terms of the second metric, this is an example of a continuous variable. And so this gives you some indication of the types of data we'll be looking for. So here we'd be looking for the number of graduates overall at different levels. So we'll be looking at first degree level, master's level, and PhD or terminal degree level, and looking at health professions versus overall number of graduates. We can't be precise about the degree courses because, of course, those will vary from university to university, but we will be providing guidance into the general areas, including the CIC codes for American institutions. And the final area there is what we call a pick list, and this is looking at health impact. So, for example, looking at the collaborations that you may have, whether they are local, national, or global, and whether you're delivering outreach programs into the local community, whether you share sports facilities with the local community, and if that's on a free access basis or a charged access basis. And then a couple of measures looking at access to mental health and sexual and reproductive health. And in all these cases, we'll be asking you to provide evidence that you do this. And as I said before, ideally via a link to a public website. We believe that the public provision of data is really important, but where that isn't appropriate, via documents. And we will be providing an email system that will allow you to email those through to us. So that was a very brief look at health. We'll go through each of these in turn. I won't go in as much detail to all of these, but hopefully this will give you an indication of the kind of things we're looking at. So for quality education, as well as looking at research, and again, that will come into, will be part of Elsevier's work, we'll be looking at focusing partly on the degree to which universities work towards primary school education and preschool education. This is a key focus of SDG number 4, is actually around primary education, but also looking at lifelong learning measures. And then finally, a measure of the proportion of first-generation students. When we've done our work in teaching analysis, proportion of first-generation students has turned out to be a very good cross-sectional measure that cuts across all kinds of educational disadvantage. So we'll be looking at this as one of our key measures here. Lifelong learning measures will be a pick list. So again, similar to the one we saw just before, where we ask about the types of things that your university may be doing in terms of supporting education, not just for people at university, but throughout their lives. So here, for example, we can see access for those not studying at university, opening your campus or your university to external activities, but also educational outreach. So it's not just enough to say, people are free to come here, but actually to what work are you doing to reach out to institutions? The final thing here is an example of a policy. And where we ask for policy, we acknowledge that a policy by itself doesn't mean that you are necessarily adhering to it, but it's usually a very good first step. But we will also be asking where you have policies to provide the date that the policy was created and the date that the policy was last reviewed. For my sins, I was once a member of Birmingham City Council, and one of the things that I learned there was that having a policy that was created back in the 80s and never looked at again wasn't a solid indicator that you were working towards it, whereas if we reviewed the policy on a regular basis, it genuinely tended to reflect a greater commitment to that particular policy area. I'm going to skip the proportion of first-generation students. I've already mentioned this as being a good indicator, but I only have just over 5 minutes to go, and I believe 9 SDGs to get through. So SDG number 5, gender equality. And again, it's worth emphasizing that the focus from the United Nations here is very much around gender equality from a women's perspective. And that really is the approach we've taken to this, even though we acknowledge that in many parts of the developed world, part of the challenge is actually around male participation in higher education. So here we have more metrics. We have six metrics, including research, first generation female students. So this will be a quite general definition of this. So it will be around the proportion of students who are the first women from their family to attend university. We will have a pick list looking at how universities support women to access university. One which will be quite interesting, I think, particularly for the more research-intensive universities, will be the proportion of women who hold senior positions in their university. So it's not enough just to get women into university. The question is, are you being a good employer in terms of ensuring that you don't have a glass ceiling in your institution? A look at admissions gender mix, and we will be subject balancing that in a very broad sense. We don't believe we can do it in a very detailed sense because although here in the UK, for example, the HESA data has exceptionally fine detailed information on this, HESA is unfortunately a rarity in the world of higher education. As we move outside the UK, the ability to access data at a fine level drops away very, very quickly. So we'll be looking at this in 3 broad areas: STEM, medicine, and arts and humanities. And we'll be subject balancing at that level. And then finally, a pick list looking at policies to support women when they're at university. So access measures will look at getting people to university. Policies will be then looking at the ability for universities to support women when they're in the university itself. Again, I'll not go through the access measure pick list or indeed the positive policies pick list now. You can look through those when we circulate the notes later on. We then skip a few SDGs and move on to two that are focused around economic growth and ensuring that economic growth is sustainable and that work is decent and available to all. So around SDG number 8, again, there will be aspects of research here. We'll also be exploring universities' employment practice, not just for the university itself, but also for outsourced services. So we do ask to make sure that if you have great policies, that you insist that the organizations you may outsource your work to also require to live by those policies. We'll have a relatively simple measure of inward investment, but we will be balancing this by the local GDP per person or per capita. So we'll be looking at that, essentially the additional resource that a university is bringing into its location. So if you're a university, and I'm going to pick on Boston unashamedly here, if you're a very well-resourced university in Boston, that's great, but Boston is a wealthy area, comparably wealthy area. We want to see how much additional resource you're bringing in above and beyond just bringing in money because you're a wealthy university. We'll be looking at the degree to which you provide employment placements for your students, and we'll also have a measure around employment security. So again, I'm not going to look at these in detail, but they will be made available later on. Security of employment, I am going to touch on briefly. This is an area where within Times Higher Education there's been a lot of debate lately around the issue of university employment becoming much more precarious. It's quite challenging to work out how to measure this consistently across the world. And in our first instance, we're going for a simple definition, which is looking for the proportion of your employees who are on a contract of more than 24 months length. So it's looking at a relatively simple measure of employment security there. However, we are specifically excluding short-term contracts that are there to cover for maternity or paternity leave. We believe that a good maternity or paternity policy is a positive thing, and we shouldn't punish universities for actually living up to that. SDG number 9, industry innovation infrastructure, is the one that we have the greatest experience building out. So we'll be looking at research and patents that are focusing specifically in this area, the number of spin-offs that universities are generating, and income from industry. And this is a measure that we also have in the World University Ranking. In terms of SDG number 10, reducing inequalities within and among countries, again, I can't spend a lot of time on this. We will be repeating the first generation metric because this is a great measure of, as I said, cross-sectional educational inequality. We'll have an interesting metric which looks at the proportion of international students from developing nations. And in this case, they will be defined as being students who are receiving financial aid and are from lower income or lower middle income countries as defined by, I think it's the World Bank, but I'll check that on the next slide. It's either the World Bank or OECD.
It is. It's World Bank.
Thank you for reminding me of that, Laura. It's the World Bank. So this is an interesting variation on international students. We have two measures looking at the proportion of students and staff who have disabilities, and then finally a section on access to the university. We are keen when we look at the proportion of international students from developing nations that this is genuinely looking at the degree to which universities can support developing nations by providing educational insight. And this map just gives you it's a slightly out-of-date measure because the income groups have been updated since the 2016 data, but this was the best map I could provide to give you an insight into that without hand coloring it myself. So the red and the orange countries were those in the lower income and lower middle income groups. You see that includes nations like India, but not necessarily China. There's been a slight variation, as I said, since the 2016 income, but it gives you a good insight into the scope of that particular measure. And in terms of access university, again, a pick list here, and here very much looking at admissions policy, making sure that you have approaches to anti-discrimination and ways to support student and faculty going forward in your institutions. SDG number 11, sustainable cities and communities. This is one I quite like because a lot of the focus on the SDGs tends to be around STEM and medicine. And here in SDG number 11, there is explicit mention of the contribution that arts and humanities can bring to the table. And we do want to, particularly in these days when arts and humanities are under pressure in higher education, we did want to have at least something in here which actively supported that. And so the metrics we're looking at, 11.1, again, research into sustainability, and 11.4, sustainable practices, are the most obvious ones. But we also wanted to look at the degree to which institutions are spending on local arts and heritage, but also acting very much as a resource for their communities. Again, the degree to which this is important will vary across the world, but this is an area where, for example, the work that Australian universities and New Zealand universities are doing in terms of recognizing the role of the indigenous communities there is pretty important and worthy of support. And I can see Ian starting to look worried that we're not progressing fast enough with the SDGs. I'll keep going. 12, responsible consumption and production. Again, research, an operations pick list, and a percentage of waste recycled. This is the area which perhaps is most familiar to data collection exercises we've seen from, for example, the STARS exercise. It's very much focused on stewardship, and that's a really crucial role here. And the other measure here, which is important as well, is the one, I think the one we can genuinely say links most closely to one of the SDG metrics, which is publication of a sustainability report. It's in there in the SDG, called out at the highest level. They want to increase, the UN wants to increase the number of organizations who are producing sustainability reports. So that's a very direct link there. SDG 13, taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Again, there will be a research element. One of the most challenging ones for us as an organization, though, is looking at the carbon footprint, because although we can ask, and we will ask universities to supply data on their energy consumption, of course, that varies according to how you're consuming the energy. So it's here where I'm glad I did physical chemistry, and I can look at trying to create calculations that will pull together measurements produced in different types of energy. So we will be asking universities to supply data on their energy consumption based on various different sources of energy, and then we will do a calculation to bring that back into what will undoubtedly be mega or even gigajoules. We'll work that out later, and then explore the proportion of that which comes from renewable and low carbon sources. The final two SDGs then, SDG number 16, promoting just, peaceful, inclusive societies. This is where we look at the governance of universities, and this will be very interesting data from my perspective. One of the things I've long believed is that the leadership and the structure of universities is something that there is far too little data exploring, and this will be our first look at how universities genuinely set themselves up as good stewards and strong organizations. But we do want to look at how universities participate with their local, regional, and national governments, and also explore the degree to which they are supplying graduates into law and civic enforcement. We think that actually universities can have a key role to play there in ensuring that we have the best possible people in those areas. And then the final SDG, before I can hand back to Ian and Fiona, and they can start pushing questions in our direction is number 17, Partnership for the Goals. We will have a measure here from Elsevier. Elsevier will be able to look at the proportion of SDG research with international co-authorship, but again, we'll be focusing on co-authorship from the lower income and lower middle income, or universities in lower income and lower middle income nations. We will be looking at relationships with non-government organizations, regional and national government. Importantly, in terms of your commitment under the SDG Accords, we'll be looking at universities publishing outputs across all of the SDGs. And we hope, but can't guarantee, to have a survey of influencers. So we're talking at the moment to a market research organization about building up a panel which will enable us to look at the impact of universities from an external perspective as well. I think it's worth saying on that, if we're unable to produce a panel that I am convinced will be genuinely worldwide and able to produce unbiased insight, and if I'm not happy with the methodology of that, we wouldn't proceed with that survey, but we do hope to be able to include it at the moment. Very briefly then, next steps, further work would be around adding the additional SDGs for subsequent years, and indeed on reviewing how successful the measurements for these SDGs have been, and the data collection process we're launching now. Data collection portal, I hope, will be open from late October. We then go into calculation. First results released in April 29, followed by a, no doubt, deep review and potential changes for subsequent years. So thank you for that. Apologies to run over and also run quite quickly through some of that. Let's try and get through as many questions as we can. So Ian and Fiona.
Duncan, Laura, thank you very much. That was quite a run through. Thank you. What a task you've taken on. Fascinating. Thank you. So this is, before Fiona speaks, I'll just say, do please put your questions. You can ask them on screen, or you can ask them on the chat facility. Monica, thank you for starting that. So please do think of your questions. We've got just over 20 minutes to go. So Fiona, could I invite you just to tell a little bit about how the EAUC's activities actually do complement and can contribute to this initiative?
Yep, certainly. So as Duncan alluded to, so the SDG Accord, as part of signing up and committing to the Accord, is that you will publicly report on that. So that is going to be included in the guidance because it is a global activity, which will help go towards the metrics of Goal 17. But also within sort of the UK and the EAUC activities that members will already be doing, there are other sort of elements that we think that will be supporting the other metrics. So, for example, the Sustainability Leadership Scorecard, which is already mapped to the SDGs, and this is a very good and easy, simple way that institutions can publicly report against their SDG impacts. So within the scorecard, there is the ability to export the report, and then that can be used as your evidence towards the metrics towards Goal 17. Also, the Green Gown Awards, which are mapped against the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly the Sustainability Reporting category would support the Goal 12 metric in terms of publication of a sustainability report. Also in Goal 16, we are soon to launch a new edition of the Governor's Guide, which can help universities improve their governance and show the value of the SDGs. Also, in terms of the research, international co-authorship for research against the SDGs. Next year, we will be launching the first ever journal for SDGs, which came out of the conference of this year, and we will hope that that will continue to be an annual publication for a special edition within a journal. So again, that can contribute to that. So we're trying to work to make sure that all of the activities that you do as members and we do as the EAUC are helping contribute towards the metrics to make this as easy and less duplication of work for members to comply with. Okay, so if we've got any questions, you can use the chat box or you can unmute yourself. I have a first question from Monica from the European Students' Union. She says, I'm not sure I heard correct, but external funding is on the list. I question if this is suitable.
So, yeah, we are looking at the degree of the economic impact of the university, and you can build some very complex models about the degree to which universities effectively support local economies. But there is no doubt that the money that universities bring in, particularly in parts of the world where, and this is not just worldwide, by the way, parts of the UK too, where you have universities who are maybe one of the biggest employers in a locality, that in itself is a positive element. Now, for the first year, we've gone for a simple measure because we want to evaluate how successful it is. But it is only one of very many measures, so it's not going to overwhelm it. I think if it does end up supporting the very wealthy universities, we will look very closely at that. Hopefully, balancing it by local GDP per capita will help to reduce that impact and also show where universities genuinely are supporting their local economy by being potentially the biggest employer.
And also, I guess, to flag that it's not about external funding in terms of grant income.
Yeah.
If that's what you're referring to, Monica.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, who do you envisage completing this index, and what will you be doing to help universities understand why this is important?
So I have no real expectations about which universities will participate. In our traditional reach at THE has been around research-intensive universities, but we have fairly strong connections with approximately 3,500 universities around the world. So it could be, I hope it will be relevant to almost any university out there. Now, what would universities gain from this? The short-term answer, or the most direct answer, is visibility. This is something I hope will become a very visible aspect of the rankings we produce. Our world university rankings have a global reach this year that has been estimated at 2.2 billion people. So there is a huge potential visible aspect there. But more importantly, it's visibility around this kind of work. It's visibility around a role which universities have been undertaking for many years but haven't necessarily got credit for. And we think that's really important in terms of the continued push from governments around funding, for example.
And also, I imagine that I think what's different here, or will be interesting from your perspective as well, is that the people actually, the information is likely to come from different parts of the university. Whether it's on the graduate side, it's going to come from different aspects of the university. So hopefully, I guess somewhere, whether through strategic planning, will be a coordination point. Then someone needs to, from a coordination perspective, will be an important role.
Okay, thank you. I've got a couple of questions. I'll put them together because they're both about goal 4. One question was why target 4.7 education for sustainable development wasn't incorporated into the indicators. And also in a key drive for universities is the explicit inclusion of the need to provide education for sustainable development in the curriculum. And can we not have that to drive the curriculum reform?
So I think that's a great point. It was interesting to me when I read the SDG in detail that 4.7 is almost the only place where teaching is mentioned, which I think personally is a bit of an oversight in terms of the definition of the SDGs. However, the reason we haven't included in the first draft is much more practical than that. It's simply about the challenges of measuring effective teaching. Through our work in the teaching rankings, we have explored that, and it is not a trivial area. We do want to find ways of including it in subsequent releases. I just don't know at the moment what those might be. It's clear that simply what we don't want to happen is a situation where universities end up with a one lecture timetabled at 6 p.m. on a Friday just before exams, which is the SDG lecture that everyone is meant to attend to, but no one goes to, even the lecturer. You know, it might tick the box, but it wouldn't be really effective. So we need to work out a way of genuinely understanding the degree to which universities are embedding the SDGs throughout their institution from an educational perspective. And if we can work out how to do that, then I would be delighted to have that in the rankings going forward.
Duncan, this is Ian here. We think EAC would say that the mission of 4.7 is quite significant, given, as you say, it is the only overt university college focused element of that SDG. And given many of us would say that focusing on number 4 is a bit of a red herring. Really, education has a critical transformational contribution to make to the realization of all of the SDGs. I think EAUC would certainly offer to work with you on finding a way of addressing that omission.
Yeah, we'd be delighted to do that. As I said, we acknowledge that this is an element that's missing this year, but to step back a little bit, I was quite keen to get something out there that we could work from and that actually made a step forward. I think if I could have been involved in 5 years of discussion around this and got nowhere. So our thoughts were very much, let's get a data collection and a ranking out there. Let's get it some visibility, but in the recognition that it's not going to be perfect in the first year, and we will make changes and improvements. And we'd be delighted to work with you, either directly or through your members, to improve in future years.
Just a quick clarification before Fiona continues with wider questions. So are we right in thinking the criteria, methodology for the imminent launch is now set? So any dialogue, any contributions, emails from our members today to the email you've given would be to give soundings towards the review of this year's and the redevelopment of next year's. Is that the status? Have we, is what you now set?
Broadly speaking, there are a couple of caveats. So the first one is in terms of precision around some of our definitions. So we've tried to step through our definitional document with a kind of worldwide perspective to try and make the definitions make sense. But inevitably, people will come up with examples where they say, I'm not certain how this fits in. And this does relate to one of the questions that was mentioned earlier. If you do want to participate, we will have a support team who are there to try and assist you in making sure that the data you're submitting is the data we're actually after. So one of the ways that your institutions can contribute very strongly is by questioning us, saying, you say you're asking for this, what do you really mean? That then gets fed into the FAQ document and helps us get a tighter and more precise definition, which is always welcome. The second area, which isn't really as precisely nailed down at this stage, is all the ones marked research. So partly this is driven by a data collection timetable. In order to have the data collection start soon enough this year, we've had to make certain decisions and nail them down in terms of developing our data collection portal. But with research, we have a slightly longer window because the results don't need to be ready until we start the calculation process early next year. So where your institutions have particular thoughts about the kind of things we should or indeed should not be looking at in terms of the research areas, then those can still definitely feed into this year's methodology.
So just on that, Duncan, about the Elsevier data that's being collected, will that detail be shared with the universities?
In terms of the definition, it will as we develop that out. At the moment, we have some broad ideas, but we're going to be workshopping those through with Elsevier to determine what actually works for particular SDGs. They've already done extensive work in this area, but we're going to be working on definitions which we think are relevant to what we're looking at, not necessarily what they've pre-populated. Just to be clear, that's not just data from Elsevier publications. It's the Scopus data set is wider than that. We also have access to other non-Scopus data sets as well.
Thank you. The next question is the plan in the future to include results of the SDG ranking into wider Times Higher university rankings? as this would really help to drive change?
That's a really interesting question. We're currently consulting on what I call World University Rankings 3.0, which is realistically probably going to be released in 2020 or possibly 2021. And so a genuine question is, can we find a way of incorporating either a summary of what we're doing here or a separate element that relates to this into the overall ranking? My immediate thought is probably not, but I can be persuaded. So please lobby me away on that one. I think there are challenges either way, and my mind is genuinely open on it.
And also on that, I think it's also about the progression of the ranking in terms of the indicators as well. So, there are lots of, I think in terms of the SDGs, there are overlapping themes and areas that the metrics are there to cover. But actually from an impact perspective as well, part of it in terms of making it relevant for the university and the HE sector is about starting the ball rolling and actually what can be measured. And so part of that progression, I think we'll see the metrics really start to move towards so what or encompass more as well the activity over time in terms of what difference is being made. So I think it is the point of it starting that ball rolling.
Thank you. Next question is, will the Life Index and the Sustainability Leadership Scorecard and the People and Planet University League be taken into account? From my understanding, Duncan, correct me if that's wrong, but basically those will be taken into account in terms of if they are publicly reported, and it can be used as evidence as part of requesting sort of the SDG report, for example, from the Sustainability Leadership Scorecard. If the institution makes that publicly available on their website, for example, that could be part of their evidence for metric 17, goal 17, for example.
Absolutely, that would be very clear evidence that they were genuinely open about their partnership and what they were doing.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just getting through. What will the Times Higher be doing to promote and encourage participation within universities?
So we have, over the last 3 weeks, I have talked to approximately 500 universities on this subject. So we launched this at our World Academic Summit in Singapore, which was attended by over 500 delegates, including the Minister for Education in Singapore. We ran 2 webinars last week, which had 330 participants. We are running an event for, at least I believe we're going to be running an event for the Association, I'll try that again, the Association of Commonwealth Universities. So we're publishing articles on it in the magazine and online as well. So we are increasingly trying to reach out. But as I said earlier, I have no expectations about how many universities will choose to participate. It could be 100, it could be 500. I really have no real feel for how many will participate. Obviously, I would love it to be more rather than fewer. And I will continue to push this. I think this is, of all the things I'm doing in my job at the moment, this is probably the one that is most interesting and exciting for me. So I'm keen on pushing it.
Okay, what are the pros and cons of submitting information under more than 4 SDGs? And will any additional credit be given if a university submits under more than 4?
So if a university submits for more than 4, clearly they will have the ability to be showcased if we look at a particular SDG by itself. So, for example, we might look at SDG 3 by itself. We might look at SDG as well as looking at it as part of the ranking. But what we're proposing to do, and this goes back to one of the design fundamentals here, what I didn't want to do is have a situation where either you had a situation where universities who had the resources to submit for all of the SDGs won, which would effectively support Western universities, to be honest, or where you had a situation where we ignored local focus. So it may well be that the universities in, let's say, Malaysia are focusing on different SDGs than the universities in Yorkshire, and that wouldn't surprise me. That would actually be a very healthy thing. So when we designed this, what our conclusion was that we would take the 4 SDGs that a university scores most highly on. So if you submit for 6 SDGs, then to produce the overall ranking, we will take the 17 plus the 3 others that you score most highly on. So the more you supply data for, then I guess the more chances you have of scoring well. And one of the aspects of that, of course, is that up till now, you may not have a very good idea of how your performance rates compared to other universities. So it'd be very difficult for you to necessarily say, well, we're going to enter these ones because we think we're the best at these. How would you compare yourselves at the moment? You wouldn't really have or you probably wouldn't have a genuine worldwide insight on that. So, sorry, I rambled a little bit there. We're running short on time, so I'll stop. But that's generally the concept there.
So there is no real benefit to an institution. They won't get any extra points for doing more than 4.
They won't, but they could get additional visibility, and they may score more highly overall as a result.
Plus, there's also, I guess, the visibility insight of actually how you're performing in the different SDG areas that are most relevant to you, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, and the one thing I would say in support of that, of course, is I'm viewing this from a data perspective, but my editorial team are really interested in the stories that this will highlight about the great work that's being done around the world. So from that aspect, we do believe that this will be supported by extensive editorial, not just on a one-off basis, but on an ongoing basis.
Thank you. So it's been asked if you can say a little bit about the process by which the metrics were developed and who was involved. For example, were academics in relevant fields consulted? It would just be helpful to understand, depending whether an institution recommends to leadership whether to participate or not.
So, as I said, we've been talking to universities around this area quite generally for a long time, pretty much since I've been, in fact, before I joined Times Higher Education back in 2015, but those were fairly unfocused conversations. It became much more focused about a year ago, and we started reaching out to specific institutions. We started talking to universities at our summit events, so we run 8 summits around the world, largely talking to university leadership. And then we became much more formal about this with bringing Vertigo Ventures on board and also around consultations at our summit earlier in this year. I mean, Laura, would you like to give a little bit more of a background of your own experience in the field?
Yes, sure, more than happy to. Yeah, so we've been working in this area for about 9 years. Started off working with not-for-profits and social enterprises to report their impact to sort of FTSE 250 chief execs, and started working with HE about 9 years ago as well with the universities. And so we've been very much focused on working with universities internationally to help them articulate really what difference is being made. And I think that's the exciting part with this and with the SDGs. So our background came from a sort of, the social investment, SROI, all those sorts of theory of change approaches we've been using in terms of supporting with impact reporting, both at a program level, at the institutional level as well. And what we've seen over the last few years is how the university, the global HE sector is looking to better to communicate what difference it's making. And so we've really used this, experience to help inform actually how do we look at the SDGs and come up with some metrics that are feasible. So I think the biggest challenge we've seen with the universities, and it'd be interesting to hear your experiences with this, is that actually gathering this information and reporting on this is actually quite as hard the first time round. And yes, the environmental pieces may be covered because they're used to reporting in this, but actually in some of the other areas where they're doing it for the first time, it can be really challenging to gather this information. So it was looking at actually what are the SDGs looking for, how do we make this feasible, and actually then working in consultation with the universities through things like the conferences, as Duncan mentioned as well.
Great, folks, our time is up. Hugely grateful to you both, Duncan and Laura, for your time today. You've conveyed a lot. We have recorded this, everyone, so it is available. Fiona, thank you for your input and handling the questions there. Final thoughts. We EAUC are very committed to working with Times Higher Education here and ensuring that this works as well as we think it can work. One concern would be when the UN and the world's governments agreed the SDGs, they agreed to their indivisibility, i.e. you cannot see all of these agendas in isolation. They're all connected, and that's where education comes in to ensure that we just don't go down a health field and miss the economic side, or go down the economic side and miss the health aspect. So this is a big complex picture. So we very much will be holding and flying the flag for that value in all of EAUC's SDG work, and we're very much encouraging Times to take that approach as well. But finally, just thank you very much all for your time. Thanks for great questions. And finally, Duncan and Laura, thank you, and we'll speak again. Thank you all.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.